Thank you all for coming this lovely sunny afternoon. Now, how many of you have heard of Paul Bunyan? Everybody, right? If I had asked that question in Janesville 100 years ago, in 1910, no one would have heard of Paul Bunyan. Nobody knew the name. Nobody had heard of Paul Bunyan. So what I want to do today is try to explain how it came about that we all know Paul Bunyan. Every 10-year-old knows Paul Bunyan, when 100 years ago, only lumberjacks in the woods knew Paul Bunyan. A couple caveats. I don't know if I need this. Let's try it without the mic for a while. If you can't hear me, wave at me, okay, you guys in the back. Also, I don't like to stand still when I talk, so I'll be walking back and forth up here. Bear with me on that. So as I say, in the 1890s, these were the people who knew Paul Bunyan. And these are the guys who made up Paul Bunyan as a character in the tales about him. That drawing there is by Eugene Shepard, who always claimed to have invented Paul Bunyan, and actually did tell the stories in the 1880s and 1890s in logging camps in northern Wisconsin. And that was his idea of what Paul Bunyan looked like. If we leap forward 100 years, here's what Paul Bunyan became. Anybody been up to Bemidji and seen the famous statue? No? A couple of you? Okay. There's a Paul Bunyan Mall, there's a Paul Bunyan bobsled race, there's restaurants, all sorts of Paul Bunyan tourist attractions now. So today's talk is about how we got there and Wisconsin's role in starting the whole thing. There are really 4 Paul Bunyans. I'm going to concentrate on the first one, the one that the lumberjacks really made up. Can you hear me back there? You okay? Okay. The one that the lumberjacks made up. Most of the pictures that you'll see today are in the book, and they're from the collections of the Wisconsin Historical Society up in Madison. So these guys, between 1885 and 1910, 1920, told stories about a lumberjack named Paul Bunyan. By the 1920s, those stories had escaped the woods, and professional writers were writing stories about Paul Bunyan for magazines and books. In the 1920s, in particular, 2 books came out in the summer of 1925 that went head-to-head with stories about a fictional Paul Bunyan. And that's when Paul Bunyan, it's at this point, that Paul Bunyan becomes this mythological hero that made the Grand Canyon and all these other things. That gets added on long after the lumberjacks. Between these years, 1925, 1945 roughly, a new book of Paul Bunyan tales came out almost every publishing season. Every spring and fall, there was some new Paul Bunyan book. At the same time, and lasting up to today, of course, Paul Bunyan became an advertising gimmick. Anybody been to this restaurant? Who's been there? There's one in Minocqua, there's one in the Dells, or Woodruff in the Dells, and there are others all over the country that use Paul Bunyan as their theme. Paul Bunyan became an advertising gimmick during World War I, aimed at lumber wholesalers. And then in the 1920s, everybody got on the bandwagon, and especially after World War II, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, it just blossomed, and that's, I think, when these restaurants started. We'll talk about that too. Finally, after World War II, particularly, Bunyan becomes the hero of children's books. The most recent one I know of came out in 2009 about his sister Paula Bunyan. We'll talk about that a little bit down the road. So that's the outline of today's talk. Along the way, I'll read from the book on occasion. Like now, to answer that basic question, who was Paul Bunyan anyway? When I read, these are all stories from the oral tradition. These aren't those later stories made up by professional writers. They're the stories that lumberjacks really told. Later on, I'll tell you how I know what lumberjacks were saying to each other. Bunyan was a powerful giant, 7 feet tall, with a stride of 7 feet. He was famous throughout the lumbering districts for his physical strength and for the ingenuity with which he met difficult situations. He was so powerful that no man could successfully oppose him, and his ability to get drunk was proverbial. He was assisted in his efforts, of course, by who? Babe, the blue ox. The blue ox measured 42 axe handles and a plug of tobacco between the eyes. When he ate baled hay, it took 3 men to pull the baling wire from between his teeth.
Paul had 18 miles of crooked logging road. It was so crooked that the new teamster couldn't make the short turns on account of the ox teams not being able to hold the loads back, because the road was downhill all the way to the landing and halfway back. Paul hooked Babe the blue ox on one end of it and jerked it straight. We also know that Paul lumbered off the Dakotas. And if you don't believe me, go to the Dakotas. You won't find any pine.
That's actually from a lumberjack, it's from a letter of a lumberjack written about 1930 who had worked in Wisconsin in the 1890s. So that's Paul Bunyan as the lumberjacks knew him. All of the stories, the original stories, center around activities that lumberjacks would have known. And you can't understand the stories if you don't understand lumberjack life. So let's take a minute to look at how lumberjacks did their jobs and what their living conditions were, since these were the guys who invented Paul Bunyan. Who goes up north? Been up north on vacation? Raise your hand. Most of us? Yep. And you know, we love to go up there. It looks like unspoiled wilderness. Well, actually, by 1930, in most northern counties, there were no trees. There were only stumps. And the trees we see today are what came up afterwards. What the lumberjacks found was hundreds of years trees that were hundreds of years old, enormous pine trees, up to 3 feet in diameter. And a lumber company would send someone called a timber cruiser out into the wilderness to say, where are the best trees? And they'd go out into conditions like this. This is 1905 in the Chippewa Valley. You can see the carriage there between the trees. And the timber cruisers would mark off sections of 40 acres square that they would then, the lumber companies would then buy. So everything was done in 40 acre square sections, just like farming in this part of the country. Then in the fall, they would send an advance crew upriver, while the rivers were open, to build a work camp for the loggers to live in. As you can see in this picture, they're often composed of 2 buildings. The one on the left is more visible, but there's one in the back you can see there. One was for sleeping and one was for eating. And they'd get all the provisions, a winter's worth of provisions hauled up there, out into the wilderness. And around Thanksgiving time, or the 1st of December, guys like you see in that picture would show up to start harvesting the trees. They worked in pairs. These were called choppers, although they're using a saw here. But they would cut a notch in the back side of the tree and then saw from the other side and fall the way it was notched. Anybody want to guess why they're sawing on this side of the tree? What's that? The notch is on the other side, and why'd they notch it there? Can anybody guess from that photograph?
So room for it to drop?
Correct, exactly. There's no trees back there behind them. So it's going to fall flat on the ground that way. So they would do that, and then when the tree was on the ground, they would strip off its branches and cut the trunk into whatever length of timber a lumber company wanted. It might be 10 feet, 12 feet, 16 feet, even 20-foot lengths, according to what the lumber company wanted. Once they had cut the trunk into sections like this, they'd be hauled out of the woods. From the 1840s to the 1870s or 80s, it was mostly oxen that were used for this. From 1880 to 1910, it was horses. So we know this is a little later picture than some of the others. And you can see they're just sliding it on a sled called a go-devil, which was kind of wedge-shaped. It could get through brush and so forth. And they were hauling the trunks to a frozen river or lake. Because the only way to transport these massive logs, I mean, think of it, they weigh a ton, is to float them down the river in the spring. So here's an early picture. This is, in fact, one of our earliest pictures. It's dated from the year 1880. And you can see the oxen, like Babe, hauling the logs out onto the ice. So lumberjacks would do this all winter long, 1st of December to, say, the middle of March. They'd be miles from civilization, in the woods, no contact with the outside world.